Hello. Today we're going to be studying East Asia in the period 1200 to 1600 CE. Let's take a look at what East Asia was looking like in about 1100, so before the period, but you can at least get a sense. So upper right, you can see Japan going across in the orange, that's Korea. The eastern part of modern-day China is in light green, that's the Song Empire. You see Vietnam there in yellow. The rest of Southeast Asia is in purple, and then you go down to the Malay Peninsula and modern-day Indonesia in orange. We've already spent some time studying the Mongols, and here we can see how the Mongol Empire conquers the Song Dynasty. They do so in 1279 and take control of all of China, and they form the Yuan Dynasty. Now, it's a pretty short-lived dynasty, as you can see there, and Kublai Khan is the founder. Kublai Khan actually adopted Chinese culture because he wanted to be a more integrated ruler, and instead of trying to just rule it directly themselves because there weren't that many Mongols. They just co-opted the Chinese bureaucracy and uh, put themselves at the top of that bureaucracy, replacing the old Song emperor. They did some good stuff. They rebuilt the Grand Canal, which is this thousands of miles long canal that we'll look at in a little bit. But part of the reason why their rule was short-lived is because there were this peasant uprisings, and they eventually drive the Mongols back beyond the Great Wall. The Mongols were the first peoples to use gunpowder and cannon against Chinese cities. Gunpowder had already existed for a couple hundred years, but was really only used in fireworks. So it's the Mongols that use it for the first time against people. They were also pretty effective at psychological warfare when they raged across Central Asia. They would roll into a region, they would go to the first town, they would say, surrender or we're going to kill everybody. They wouldn't surrender, and then the Mongols would storm the city and kill everybody and build pyramids of their corpses. And then they'd go to the next city and they'd say, "Hey, we're gonna conquer you now," and then they'd open their doors. And once they did that, the Mongols, usually didn't actually attack them or anything like that because the people who surrendered were accepting Mongol rule. The Mongols conquered Korea, and they attempted to conquer Japan twice, but neither time was successful. And then a lot of the reason why we know about Kublai Khan and about the Yuan dynasty is because a guy you may have heard of before, Marco Polo, traveled to China. And in fact, he worked in the bureaucracy. He lived there for 20 years. And eventually, when he did return to Venice, he told his tale. Initially, nobody believed him. But it turns out that most of what he wrote was, in fact, true. So we're going to move on to China now. So here's China in about 1215. So this would be before the Mongol conquest. So you can see there the southern Song Empire. The Jin Empire is affiliated with the Mongols, but that's not the most advanced areas at this time. You can see Tibet there as well, and a little tiny bit of India on the side. So we're going to look at Chinese culture, and the important thing that for you to keep in mind is that the Han Chinese culture is continuous since 200 BCE. So this is a culture that, all cultures evolve a little bit, but we're still talking about the exact same culture, whereas we could really only talk about, say, English cultures going back about 1,000 years. They refer to themselves as the Middle Kingdom. Part of that is because they saw themselves as being at the center of the world. Um, and then you also, just looking geographically at China, you have mountains to the north, you have desert to the west, you have jungle to the south and mountains, and you have ocean to the east. So they really saw themselves in kind of this bowl surrounded by all of these sort of more inhospitable lands. And then in the middle of that, they don't have any climate extremes, unlike those areas. So they really kind of thought that their land was really at the center of the known world. Um, Food, a lot of foods that were a part of Chinese culture were existent, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. So we're talking about rice, we're talking about wheat noodles, which we would call spaghetti because Marco Polo brought the recipe with him back to Europe. Stir fry using, woks and the use of tofu as a main source of protein, the use of chopsticks to eat. And then after the Columbian Exchange got going, they started to incorporate some of those agricultural products from the Americas, like maize or corn, peppers, and potatoes. But after the fall of the Yuan dynasty and the Mongols are out, then the Ming dynasty comes in and they reestablish like that traditional Chinese culture that may have been a little suppressed under the Mongols. So the Ming Dynasty. It was founded in 1368 by a gentleman named Hung Wu, who had been a peasant, but he was literate because he had been raised in a monastery. And he was one of the leaders of those peasant revolts that ended up tossing the Mongols out of China. He had belonged to one of the anti-Mongol secret societies. So a couple examples of those societies would be the White Lotus Society and the Red Turbans. The White Lotus Society actually comes back in the 1800s in an effort to throw the Europeans out of China. So that ends up getting revived hundreds of years later. The Ming Dynasty was a reaction to the Mongol period, and so it establishes or reestablishes like very traditional Chinese culture. In the Ming period, China is pretty conservative and xenophobic, and really only looks inward. They're not interested in discovering new lands and all that kind of stuff. So Hung Wu was a reformer. Because he had been a peasant, he understood how oppressive the tax system was on the peasantry, and so he reforms the tax system. He was a builder or a rebuilder, I guess, in some cases. So he repopulates agricultural areas that had been depopulated over the period of the Mongol rulership. He also rebuilt the Great Wall, which makes sense because they were trying to keep the Mongols out. He rebuilt the Grand Canal. So there you see a picture of the Grand Canal. We'll look at a map in a little bit, but it is thousands of miles long. And the Ming Dynasty came in and rebuilt it more or less to the condition that you see it there in that image. Obviously not with the electric light. Um, he built the early, they built reservoirs, they built canals, irrigation systems, flood protection because the major rivers in China do flood. Uh, and ultimately, this was all to the betterment of Chinese civilization. Looking at politics in the Ming Dynasty, it was a very, very centralized government. This is the absolute opposite of feudalism. All of the major decisions in China go through the emperor, all of them. And Hung Wu really further concentrated the power of the imperial bureaucracy, which is called the Grand Secretariat. And so, this model works great if the emperor is great. When the emperor is not great, this is not a great system. It's also a fairly small bureaucracy given the size of China. You got 2,000 bureaucrats for 100 million people. That's a big country in the 1400s. Uh, they had sort of modern style administrative provinces. So, you've broken up all of China into these regions and they're administrated locally, but by the bureaucracy. Uh, uh, you had a lot of very powerful eunuchs. Eunuchs are men who've been castrated who work within that bureaucracy, and a big reason why they're there is because, given that they cannot produce sons, they have no ambition towards becoming the emperor, and therefore they are a lot, or thought to be a lot more trustworthy. But they were also seen as an other, and so they were definitely hated. But just one example of a eunuch who rose to a very high status in society is the explorer Zheng He, who we will look at in a little bit. So China saw itself as the center of the world, and that has a tendency to make you somewhat arrogant about your role in the world. And so, as it did interact with other nations, it was establishing a tributary system. And the way that works is China says, if you give us money, we won't invade your country and destroy you. And if you're a smaller country that's adjacent to China, like say Vietnam, that seems like a pretty good deal. So your nation acknowledges China's superiority, and then you get to run your own affairs. And so this was widespread across all of the border regions with China. And in fact, during Zheng He's voyages around the Indian Ocean, the king of Ceylon or Sri Lanka refused to submit and refused to engage in that tributary system, and Zheng He uh, captured him until he agreed to accept the tributary system. In addition uh, to the political side, they also exported Buddhism to Mongolia because they thought, hey, if the Mongolians become Buddhists, they'll be more peaceful, and it worked amazingly. But just in case, they also rebuilt the Great Wall, as we've said, and then later on they start to have a problem with Japanese piracy. It's part of the reason they wanted to have that tributary system with Japan, but Japan was kind of didn't have a really strong central government at that point, and so they couldn't really control the pirates, and the Ming couldn't really control the pirates, and that demonstrated the weakening of the Ming government, and we'll see how that impacts Chinese society in the next video on East Asia. So we mentioned Zheng He. He was this world traveler. You can see on the map how far he explored, right? So he went all the way to East Africa across the Indian Ocean, made lots of stops. And this wasn't just like, one ship going around the world. He would bring up to 60 vessels, and they would have troops as well as trade goods. And their technology was much better than European technology throughout this period. Their ships were much faster than the Portuguese ships that would come along a couple of centuries later. Um, but unfortunately, these voyages did not end up actually making money. They cost money, and so China kind of looked at this, and because they weren't interested in conquering and they weren't making any money from these voyages, they were sort of like, well, why are we bothering? Because they didn't really think anything else was terribly interesting that was going on in the world. Because again, China had this idea that they were the center of the world and their culture was, superior to everyone else's. Now, China had a huge economy. It was bigger than Europe's, and that's just their domestic economy. And so, because they're not interested in trade with other nations, their economy is based around their domestic market, right? Their internal market. They're not trading with other nations. They're not engaged in exports. Initially, currency was paper currency, but once they start trading with the Europeans, they start having a large influx of silver, primarily from the Americas, because of how much silver Spain was taking out of the Americas. And that was really the only thing that the Europeans had that China wanted was silver. And so much silver comes in that the government changes the rules, and now you don't pay your taxes in labor anymore. They used to require you to come out for a certain period of time every year, peasants to come out at a certain time and go and work for the state, digging out the Grand Canal when you're rebuilding the Grand Canal, things like that. So that changes to you have to pay your taxes in silver, and that actually creates a lot of problems for the peasantry, because while you have large amounts of silver coming into China, it's not going into the hands of the peasantry. Uh, China had a national banking chain, which sounds crazy when we're talking about, 600 or 700 years ago, but that's how advanced their economy was. Just like today we have national banking chains. China had that as well. So you could deposit your money in one city in China, travel to another city in China, and take your money out from that same banking chain, just like we do today. They also used credit in the same way. They called it flying money, but it was the same concept, you also see the growth of the guilds, becoming powerful institutions. Guilds are organizations for people who do the same thing. So you might have like a carpenter's guild, right, or a merchant's guild or something like that. And ultimately, what we see is a shift, just like we see in Europe. We see a shift of capital away from land as being the main source of capital to trade and craft exports by the end of the Ming period. That is the principal source of capital. So, Hung Wu, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, he wasn't interested in foreign trade, as we've gone over. He really was interested in improving that domestic market, and so part of that is the reforming of the tax system. Part of that is some infrastructure work. He also instituted a state monopoly on salt and on tea. So the only people who could buy and sell salt and tea was the state, and so then the state is getting all of the profits from the sale of salt and tea. Commerce is discouraged. I mean, we've talked about all of this, the necessity of it, and yet merchants were viewed in society as parasites. They were at the very bottom of the social order. They were seen as very greedy. They were going against the principles of Confucianism, but they're wealthy, so they can pay for protection. And the ones that have become very successful don't mind, the low status within society. And then later on, we see a giant expansion of commerce, and then the negative feelings about businessmen start to go away. They never fully go away, but they start to go away. And we see lots of silk and cotton production. The silk production, for the most part, is going into an export market. So you are starting to see the economy shift more towards exports, primarily with Europe, primarily because of the silver. Some different types of exports from the Ming. Yes, we see cotton, although we'll also see India kind of supplant them in terms of the cotton export market, and then America also. Uh, they export cooking oil, and oil is also used for lighting during this period. They were refining sugar 300 years before the Europeans were refining sugar. And then the crafts, and the crafts are the ones that really sold well in Europe. So we're talking about the porcelain that you see on the screen. That's a Ming Chinese specific look, and that kind of Ming porcelain is incredibly valuable today. So the Ming were at the forefront of technology, not just during this period, but overall. They had cotton mills 250 years before England's Industrial Revolution took off. Um, they were printing long before Europe was printing. It was a little bit harder for China because, you have 3,000 characters that are symbolic as opposed to having an alphabet. An alphabet works a lot better for a printing press because you have, in English, you have 26 characters, uppercase and lowercase. And so that becomes very easy to rearrange those characters into printing whatever you want. So it's a little bit harder in China. They also developed the suspension bridge hundreds of years before those first get developed in Europe and the United States. They had a wind-powered wheelbarrow, which sounds totally cool. And then they also, built and improved upon a giant canal network that connected to rivers and really created that unified China. And here we see the Ming Empire in the year 1500. And if you were to include Tibet, which was independent during this period, this looks a lot like modern China. So we're going to move on to Korea now. Now, in the West, there's a tendency to mush all East Asian cultures together. And that is one, it's mildly racist, but two, it's just wrong, right? The Korean people originated up in Siberia, in northern Manchuria, and their language is completely unrelated to either Mandarin or Cantonese. So, one of the ways that we look at different cultures is by linguistic families. And Korea, the Korean language is not related to Chinese. They have their own written language called Hangul. That's the alphabet that you can see there in the upper right-hand corner. Korea was independent, but it was heavily influenced culturally by China. So think of like Canada. Canada is independent of the United States, but their culture is heavily influenced by ours. Korea was politically independent from 220 to 1910, other than the period that the Mongols were in charge of about, a century or so. Uh, the Mongols forced the Korean people to help attack Japan. The Mongols were not a seafaring people. They had a land-based empire, but the Koreans were very attached to the sea, and so you have a lot of sailors there, and they're forced to help attack Japan, but we know that those attacks were not successful. The ruling dynasty in Korea from 1392 to 1910 were the Yi dynasty, and within that dynasty you have, during that historical period, you have an educated and hereditary aristocracy called the Yangban, and so this is another area where we see an aristocracy that has a lot of power. The climate and the geography in Korea were really bad for economic development. It's heavily mountainous. You have bitterly cold winters. It's hard to traverse the peninsula, and only about a seventh of the land can be cultivated. So, Korea turns to the sea to get a lot of its food. From a technological perspective, Korea had metal-clad ships 300 years before the American Civil War, which is how people in the West are taught the first metal-clad ships come into being. And then Korea also had the first use of movable type. Korean language is an alphabet, and so just like in the West, alphabets translate very easily into being used in a printing press because you can just rearrange all those characters very easily for anything that you want to print. So let's move on to Japan. So, looking a little bit at geography, Japan it's an island chain, and there are four main islands, and if the land adds up to being about the size of California. But the northern island called Hokkaido was really only settled in large numbers in the 20th century by the ethnic Japanese people. You have a different people up there called the Ainu, and they were the original inhabitants of the Japanese island chain. And today, sadly, like what we see in the United States, they live on reservations up in Hokkaido. The Japanese island chain is mostly mountainous, so like we saw with Korea, that has impacts on political and economic centralization. This is another nation that is very geared towards the sea as a source of food rather than, large scale food production, on the islands like we would see in Europe or in the United States. Japanese culture, Buddhism arrives in the 700s, and the Japanese adapt Buddhism to a form that fits Japanese culture, and so we call that Zen Buddhism. While there were cultural elements from China that came in, including the use of some of the symbols from the Chinese written language, it never fully took hold, right? Japan still to this day has a very separate identity from that of China, and historical events in the last 100 years have made those differences even stronger. They have a written language just like Korea, just like China. It's called Kana, and it is combined with Chinese characters to form a fully fleshed out written language. Talking about politics, feudalism ruled the day in Japan, not a Chinese style bureaucracy. You have samurai, you have a group called daimyo. You can see the pyramid there in the upper right hand corner of the different roles. Now, at the top, you don't officially have the shogun. At the top, you officially have the emperor, but the emperor is divine and is not really involved in politics, and it's the shogun who is officially the emperor's military commander who has the real power. And then the vassals report, the daimyo, they report to the shogun, and then they have their own network of samurai, which kind of fills the role, if we're comparing it to Europe, with with petty nobles, knights, things like that. But those samurai, they develop their own private armies, and they have territories that they rule over. And they're different than they're depicted in popular culture. They're really more administrators than they are fighters. But they're educated, they're literate. But you also have a weird situation where you, across the countryside, you have armed factions of Buddhists who fight each other, which is sort of weird because we don't think of Buddhism as being a religion that's about fighting. Um, the government, the official government that covers much of the period that we're studying right now, is called the Ashikaga shogunate. So it's the Ashikaga family that fills that role of shogun. Again, you officially have the emperor at the top, but the emperor doesn't actually have the political power. Um, but the Ashikaga had really weak central control. You have a lot of civil wars during this period, and this is also the period when you have Japanese pirates raiding the coast of China and kind of being an embarrassment to the governments of both China and Japan because nobody could really control them. And then the very end of the period we're studying, a guy named Hideyoshi, who had been a peasant, seizes control of the government and starts a new shogunate, which we will look at in the next period of East Asian history. But Hideyoshi centralizes the tax system, disarms the population so that there would be a little bit more peace. So Japan's foreign relations, they're in, they're not as inward looking as China, but they're also not sailing the high seas looking for new markets. We know that Kublai Khan tries to invade Japan. He demanded their submission, but the invasions failed, and at that point, then they kind of just gave up on Japan. But we know that piracy was a problem, and nobody could stop them, and that weakened both governments. Thank you for staying to the end of my presentation, and feel free to check out one of the other videos.